Hello and good evening. It's a little disjointed to see you so far away. Thank you, Taekwon, for this invitation to talk tonight about a recent and rather ambitious project that I've been involved with. It was a collaboration between the Getty Conservation Institute in New York, in Los Angeles, I should say, and the ICOMOS 20th Century Committee. We set out to develop something which we now call the 20th Century Historic Thematic Framework. We did it because internationally, although professional and scholarly interest in 20th century heritage places is growing, very few of them are actually being listed. They're always underrepresented, sometimes entirely absent from heritage surveys. And all too often, they're suddenly put at risk through a lack of public awareness and strategic planning for their conservation or adaptive reuse. The framework's been designed to be a useful tool and a catalyst for identifying these kind of places. And we hope it'll be helpful for governments, professionals, heritage agencies, and communities that are all working to protect these kind of places. The slide that you see on the screen at the present time is, of course, the wonderful Ario Sheridan designed airport terminal, the building in New York designed for TWA in 1962. But it was underutilised and eventually closed in 2001 because it was unable to support the size of modern aircraft. There was a lot of pressure for its demolition, and until 2017, there was no idea what it would be used for. At that time, finance was available and a scheme was prepared to refurbish and extend the building. And it actually opened in 2019 as a hotel, a very successful one. Airports are typically examples of the types of 20th century heritage sites where technical obsolescence, i.e. short life cycles, often leads to their very swift replacement. As I understand its history, Kai Tak Airport had 60 years of operation, and during that time it was constantly being rebuilt. And hospitals and leisure facilities often have similarly reasonably short life cycles. 20th century, sometimes the deterioration of often experimental building materials or construction techniques often create forceful demands for demolition or loss. And concrete, one of the most prominent materials of the 20th century, can be problematic and expensive to repair, although current conservation research is finding new ways around doing that. And since it's a very resource-intensive material, conserving its embodied energy is a good way to go. So we're looking forward to seeing that research be more widely used ahead. In some heritage jurisdictions, there's also a statutory limit on the age of a building that can be protected or recognised. It used to be that 25 years was sometimes cited, a generation effectively, but this approach is increasingly rare as values-based heritage approaches replace statutory age limits. We look to see what the values of the place are rather than its age alone. Increasingly too, adaptation, reactivation, new uses are being found for 20th century buildings, sometimes for very unusually designed buildings. We'll look at a few of those in a moment. And I think also as governments and communities are taking up their responsibilities for achieving the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, we're being pressured and promoted as decision makers to look very much at the embodied energy that's in 20th century sites and make that more of a significant factor in the decisions about development and destruction. Now, architectural icons like this Sheridan building may attract interest and global support even, but the less glamorous but nonetheless significant 20th century places are also something we should be concerned about. Sometimes the infrastructure that's being created for rapid urbanisation, which is a feature that absolutely characterised the 20th century like no other, is worth looking at. The transport, communication, health and leisure developments that characterise the 20th century are some of the diverse stories that I'd like to look at tonight. If I can have the next slide, please. As you may know, ICOMOS is a global NGO that works for conservation and protection of significant cultural places. It's based in Paris and it has more than 10,000 members globally, made up of 90 national committees. It's a big one in China and a large one in Australia. New Zealand, the Philippines, Japan and Singapore are a few in our region. There are also 30 international scientific committees and working groups, and they look at, obviously, discipline-specific issues: cultural landscape, climate change, intangible heritage, wood, stone, and indeed 20th century heritage. In Australia alone, there are 600 members. They're architects, archaeologists, planners, curators, administrators, and there are similar member disciplines in ICOMOS China. And for over 40 years, ICOMOS has created standards, guidance, and undertaken professional training for industry leaders and administrators. Because it's an advisory body to UNESCO on the World Heritage Convention, it also makes advice on nominations and on state of conservation reports for those places. In Australia, we have a thing called the Conservation Plan and the Borough Charter, which are our seminal documents, the things that really dictate our professional and philosophical approach to heritage. And in China, the China Principles, which were developed by SACH and the GCI with some Australian partners, has been instrumental in guiding heritage practice in China in recent years. To provide a little context to the project I'm talking about tonight, I'll just briefly introduce the Scientific Committee on the 20th Century. It was established in 2005, and its initial research was to understand how 20th century heritage was being recognised and being managed. But absolutely immediately, it was also called upon to advocate for the conservation of unrecognised 20th century heritage places that were on the brink of being lost. We also had a major role in providing guidance about World Heritage listing of modern places, as the oeuvres of Frank Lloyd Wright, Le Corbusier, Gaudi came up for very swift nominations. As a priority, we decided to develop a best practice guidance note for 20th century heritage places, and that's what you see on the screen. It was developed between 2011 and 2017, and it's now been translated into 18 languages, so it's evidently popular and useful, and I commend it to you. But heritage emergencies kept on demanding that we get more involved in the heritage advocacy issues. So we had to look at an approach to handle that. And that approach was something called heritage alerts. Here we see sites in Moscow, Sydney, Stockholm, and Berlin that have all been the subject of heritage alerts in recent years. Now, these ones have been successful, more or less, but far more were not successful, and those buildings and places have now been lost. In all the cases, they shared a uniform sense of urgency. Pretty much every building was on the verge of demolition. And so we developed a process and a template that rigorously examined. We developed a template and a methodology, and we shared that for local and national actions, so that if somebody felt they had a site of the 20th century on a national level that was important, they could use just the same methodology. But even as we were negotiating these individual cases, most of them were as a last resort. The demolishers were at the door, the consent for redevelopment had already been given. And we knew that early identification would be a preferable action. Here's three very typical heritage alert cases. On the left, the Prentice Hospital in Chicago, which was demolished in 2018. It's in the process of being demolished in this photograph. The engagement came too late. The redevelopment decisions had already been made by the state in that case. On the right-hand side, we see the Indian Institute of Management, designed by Louis Khan in Ahmedabad in India. It's currently slated for demolition, but the 20th Century Committee has opened a path of ongoing negotiation and support for additional research and advice. This is an ongoing case, and it will probably take some time to resolve. The central photograph is, of course, the West Wing of the government offices here in Hong Kong, where local community organisations were very visible, articulate and well-informed, and they gave the 20th Century Committee a great basis to lend international level advice and support, and in a timely way, which was successful in influencing the retention and the reuse of this very important building. ICOMOS also tried to take a slightly longer view to have a look at what the trends were about risk analysis. These reports are assembled annually by ICOMOS Germany. All the national committees have input, and they look at the risks and solutions. So not just the sites that are having problems, but how they have been reused, adaptively changed, what solution and best practice is coming forward. There's already been a special thematic issue on 20th century and one on underwater heritage. But still we found, no matter how many reports and so forth were being written, there was a lot of sites still coming to us asking for international intervention. Of course, there was also good outcomes, and we should celebrate those. Gradually, there's been a strong demonstration that 20th century places are becoming more visible as heritage within their local communities. Since 2000, the UNESCO Asia Pacific Awards for Cultural Heritage Conservation have been recognising the efforts of private individuals and organisations in restoring and transforming structures. And most recently, we see a number of 20th century buildings starting to come through. It's great to see these projects, and there's three of the more recent ones in Hong Kong, being awarded and recognised for the values that they represent. Great projects, great outcomes. But there was still no general approach to how we might identify 20th century. So we started to look at developing a historic thematic framework. Now, what does that mean? Well, it was responding not only to the sites that were being nominated for World Heritage listing and the ones that were coming under threat, but it was also because when we look at World Heritage listing, we need to have a good assessment of the comparative values of a place. And that was quite difficult to do with some of these sites because they appeared to be unique, but it was generally because the contextual research hadn't been done. In 2001 to 2005, ICOMOS collaborated with UNESCO and DOCOMOMO to run a series of meetings in the Modern Heritage Program. There were regional meetings in Monterey, Chandigarh, Asmara, Miami and Alexandrina. And there was also a number of existing research projects, which you see on the screen there, that were considered. The wonderful DOCOMOMO report done in 1997, focusing just on the modern movement. The International Union of Architects 20th Century Architectural Heritage Register was also something worth looking at, and the ICOMOS study of gaps in the World Heritage listing, and the TICI study of various types of thematic studies that they've done. All of these were really useful. On a national level, the US Park Service had been developing thematic frameworks for many years. They started in 1936 and they've revised it many times since. Here in Australia, we've had a historic themes analysis since 2001. It's been adapted and is still in use today. And there's a similar version in Canada, although they've most recently reviewed theirs, and they've got a really excellent publication up on their website now called A Framework for History and Commemoration that was done in 2019. But all of these studies are relatively light on when it comes to thinking about 20th century. They tend to think more generally about all forms of heritage. And the examples that they give tend to always be the great architects, the iconic buildings, and they are reasonably well recognised. But even so, these two on at the bottom of the slide here, who were buildings designed by Richard Neutra in the 1960s, the cyclorama at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, have still been more recently demolished, indeed by their owners, the National Park Service in this case. So the issue was not only that heritage of the recent past was not being recognised, but also that the buildings that were being recognised and the sites were not representative of the full range of 20th century heritage stories. This slide shows a selection of the buildings which are currently recognised as being 20th century that are on the World Heritage List. But ICOMOS wanted to look beyond those great works, beyond the great masters, and to look more holistically at the full range of 20th century and to identify them before they came to be at risk. We hoped that we could develop a framework that would be used globally and readily adapted to local situations as well. For several years, we tried to initiate a project, but we found we just couldn't get it off the ground until, very fortunately, the Getty Conservation Institute came to our rescue to help finance it. At the conclusion of 2011, they ran a workshop in Los Angeles where the participants examined all the historic themes that were currently being used globally and decided that something new needed to evolve for the 20th century. So although thematic frameworks aren't a new idea, and many nations were doing them in one way and another, it was quite a challenge to think about how we would do one for just 100 years, 1 century. We could draw on all of the documents that I've shown you already, and there were also increasingly specific thematic studies, such as the ones that you see on the screen now. And in fact, the LA meeting started to come up with a list of indicative sites, but we started to worry about creating too many lists of sites because that wasn't our objective. Our objective was really to say what are the themes, and then for site identification to come later. We created a representative international project reference group that met regularly throughout the course of the event, and we also had a smaller internal group within the Getty Conservation Institute that were advisors. The first meeting that we had, we decided that we'd go externally for consultants, and we advertised globally, and 4 consultant teams were interviewed. They all demonstrated great insight and understanding about thematic nature and the practical scope of the study, but they had different degrees of experience and potential. Eventually, we selected Professor Peter Sperrit and Dr. Susan Marsden, who worked with Professor Leo Schmidt and Dr. Julian Holder, who were appointed as expert advisors. At the very first meeting, when the first consultant report arrived, there was hot debate because whilst it was agreed that there were specific phenomena that characterised the 20th century, new technology, social changes, political landscapes, they all manifested themselves at different times in different parts of the world. So what was a global theme and what was a regional theme? The drivers of development were different in every geopolitical context, really, and at different times. For instance, in Australia, the impact of new methods of transportation, specifically aviation, has been a principal driver of development nationally. In the illustrations on the left, you see a 1945 map of the Australian air routes compared with the 2019 Qantas Flight magazine map, and it demonstrates the impact of the growth of civil aviation across this vast continent. And it also documents the early and the seminal routes and where the terminals are. Yet only one airport in Australia was then heritage recognised, let alone heritage listed. When we received a second consultant report, it was at an in-person workshop in Los Angeles in May 2016, and it was no less vigorous in the debate that went on. The project reference group reviewed the resulting draft report, and then we had a peer review group also revise it. The reason for having so many different minds think about it was that it was very difficult to generalise about an entire century and about the experience of all regions through that century. But after about a 2-year back and forth with the consultants and review groups, we came up with the 10 slides that are on the next screen, if we could have that. So the next screen shows you those 10 sites. Each of them are described in the report by overview essays, and there is a gallery of indicative photos that follows on. And of course, many of these themes began in the 19th century and they only come to fruition in the 20th. And other themes continue strongly now into the 21st century. So there's overlap, and some sites are representative of several themes. The indicative site that I'm showing you here is a barrage al Kuwait, which is part of the desalination and water distribution system of Kuwait. So it's representative of that second theme, accelerated scientific and technological development. It was built for the emerging nation of Kuwait because giving access to reliable water supplies enabled the rapid expansion of the city of Kuwait in the 70s and 80s. So representative of the first theme, rapid urbanisation and growth of cities. The system itself was designed by Sune Lindström for the Swedish firm Sweco, but these 3 towers were the work of Danish designer Malene Born. The geodesic viewing sphere is by Buckminster Fuller, and the system was built by Kuwaiti and Yugoslav crews. So it's also representative of the World Trade and Global Corporation thing. The tower was inaugurated in 1977 and seriously damaged during the invasion of Kuwait in 1990. So it's also representative of war and its aftermath. The tower includes a restaurant and viewing tower, representative of popular culture and tourism, and it's now on Q8's tentative World Heritage List, so also representative of preserving buildings and landscapes. So you can see that one site can represent many things, but there are often sites that only represent one. Let's have a very quick look at each of the themes. It's about rapid urbanisation and the growth of large cities. I don't think I really need to explain that to you. It's pretty self-evident what it means, but the sorts of things that we don't often look at in heritage studies are freeways, pedestrian overpasses, large and complex housing estates. And yet these are the things that are now being looked at in some jurisdictions for heritage listing, most notably all of those things in Britain at the present time. If I can have the next slide, was about accelerated scientific and technological development. Once again, you can imagine your way through all of these kinds of developments, from health developments like the TB sanatoria that were very common across Europe in the 20th century, facilities such as the pumping station in Hong Kong, very common across the world but very rarely heritage listed. Good to see that yours is. Space station research. These kind of things are characteristic only of the 20th century. And of course, engineering feats like the amazing bridge in Switzerland and many more infrastructure type of elements. Theme 3, the next one, is about industrialised and mechanised agriculture. Here we see massive changes to the way landscapes are used. And although subsistence farming, of course, using age-old techniques still exists in many parts of the world, many parts of the world are also impacted by these kind of agricultural pursuits. They started from the invention of the tractor in 1900, and they go through aviation, crop dusting, mass transport by rail and road. The next theme is theme 4, world trade and global corporations. And this was an area of very dynamic change during the 20th century. In the early 1900s, we had trade unions, labour and working conditions were pressing issues throughout the world. And as technology accelerated, the need for new fuels, usually oil, resulted in the movement of large companies into regions with oil reserves into the Middle East. And the drilling, import and export of fuels became a major factor in world trade and gradually changed the impact or changed the look of most of the ports of the world. Mass communication and transportation systems, we've touched upon that earlier. At the beginning of the 20th century, though, mass communication was really characterised mostly by telephone and electricity and postal service. But by the end of the 20th century, it was much more towards digital communication made possible by the computer. Telephone communications were then being transmitted by satellites instead of wires, and mobile phones were just beginning to replace landlines. The signal tower at Blackhead Hill in Hong Kong just operated for 20-odd years, and the dropping of the time ball only ceased in 1933. It represents really a technology that came and went just within the century. Until the 1960s, ships dominated international travel between continents until air travel offered much quicker and considerably cheaper trips. These changes necessitated the construction of roads, highways and airports, as well as the multitudes of operations that are linked towards these places. Fueling stations, repairs, automotive showrooms and so forth. The next theme, theme 6, is internationalisation, the rise of nation states and the rise of human rights. Not surprisingly, imperialism and decolonialisation, democracy and socialism were the hottest issues of debate in all the peer reviews that happened on this report. At the 20th century start, when it opened, many governments ruled colonies under their control because of long-standing imperial sanction. The Ottoman, the Qing dynasty in China, the Russian Romanov Empire were dominant political entities that had ruled for centuries, but by 1920 had almost ceased to exist. By the end of the century, the planet had nearly 200 sovereign nations, some of them newly independent post-colonial states. The 20th century was a time when revolution sometimes succeeded not only in replacing formidable empires with nascent nation states, but also in furthering the concept and the pursuit of human rights within nations and internationally. Internationalism and the rise of international law is typified by the United Nations headquarters in New York, which you see here, and the century was also characterised by the growing recognition and demand for individual rights, civil rights, including new social movements such as women's suffrage, then the women's liberation movement, Indigenous people's rights, and the rights and recognition of minority groups within larger societies. And this was actually the last theme that we added in, and we had a lot of debate about whether it was an individual theme and concluded that it was, but I'll be very interested to hear your thoughts on this. This was about the preservation movement. And although the preservation movement had some antecedents in the 19th century, it really comes into most prevalent action through the 20th century. Certain actions and projects, such as the construction of the Aswan Dam in Egypt, shown here, produced widespread condemnation and outrage and led to calls for the protection of natural and cultural heritage, which culminated in the World Heritage Convention in 1972. There's also a lot of local and national preservation laws, and there's some examples there of sites that actually prompted the beginning of statutory protection. The institutionalisation of formal legislation and protective mechanisms to identify places also set new standards for conservation. The brief overview that's in our essay on this particular theme talks about environmental destruction, nature conservation, and international cooperation. And one of the very strong things that we're seeing coming through in the 21st century, though not in the 20th, is the engagement of conservation practice with the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. And I hope we'll talk about that later too. The eighth theme was about popular culture and tourism. Leisure time increased tremendously in the 20th century for some sectors of society, and this led to the creation of new and expanded forms of entertainment. While spectator sports are not new, the size of sports facilities and the size of sporting audiences has increased dramatically on a global level. Cinema, radio, record players and television all provided for the widespread transmission of popular culture, leading to the sharing of pop culture between disparate communities. And the rise of mass tourism is something that Hong Kong knows a lot about, and steadily increasing, though not universal, access to improvements in living and working conditions. Public health, education and recreation facilities also are characteristic of this theme. The next theme, theme 9, is about religion, mass education and cultural institutions. And of course, all of those have also existed in previous centuries and continue to exist in this century. But adherence to religious, specific religious forms definitely declined through the 20th century, and it increased in other areas. What we see is the construction of new places of worship that left a unique 20th century record. The role of the state in religious observance has also changed. Some states discouraged or even banned religious practices. In other societies, states favoured one particular religious tradition over another. Sometimes whole countries, such as India and Pakistan, were formally separated on the basis of religion, and it seems to be a very strong characteristic in the 20th century. Literacy also increased in significant numbers worldwide during this century, the results of governments sponsoring mass education to their population. And this includes the building of schools and universities at an unprecedented rate. Cultural institutions have also increased in prevalence and size, often resulting in works of great architecture. So major and large institutions have proliferated through the century as societies benefited from educational activities which either were created or expanded, and institutions such as large museums, libraries, archives and art galleries found global audiences far beyond their national reach. The last theme, unsurprisingly but sadly, is war and its aftermath. Warfare and conflict between peoples has, of course, always existed, but the scale of 20th century warfare is without precedent. There were world wars, civil wars, wars for independence and genocide. There was the Cold War and all its ramifications. Military sites are strongly represented in Hong Kong's heritage listing, and indeed, looking very briefly at the 14,000 plus historic sites that are listed, the number of buildings built in the 20th century is really quite high pre-World War II, but very specific in its typology, the colonial buildings, churches and the military barracks. But the last 70 years is missing. The more diverse stories of globalisation, rapid urbanisation, tourism and popular culture, of course, continue past World War II, but they don't seem to be listed yet. Of course, heritage listing doesn't directly equate with conservation, but identifying heritage values for early consideration, planning and development decisions is strategically important. So what we tried to do with this study was to develop a very robust way of looking at identifying 20th century heritage places that might be significant. It provided a tool to survey and analyse areas, to make connection between perhaps diverse places, and a way to record and promote and protect these places. What we found as this study started to be implemented is that what people often tend to do right away is identify knowledge gaps and focus research and action for specific kinds of 20th century places. So as we discuss it tonight, it would be interesting to think about how the thematic framework might apply to Hong Kong. If I could have the next slide. For example, popular culture and tourism, theme 8, might be an interesting thematic study in Hong Kong with its huge post-war and ongoing stories of opera, cinema, tourism and leisure industries. Or a specific post-war thematic study might be interesting across all the themes. But you might also perceive biases and gaps in what I've talked about today. There's lots of ways of looking at this, and as I pointed out to you, the controversy involved in just bringing it together demonstrated that there's lots of ways to look at this issue. We see this document as a starting point, as a platform for discussion, for use, for adaptation, and we really welcome discussion about it. I hope it'll be useful to you. I hope it's something that you will find challenging perhaps and fascinating as well as you read it. All of the lovely photographs and so forth that I've been able to use. And the final slide. Those are the themes, and I would be very happy to take any questions or comments that people would like to make. I know that's been rather a rush.
So at this point, given the 10 themes that are shown in the framework, we would like to know your thoughts and your about Hong Kong's 20th century. So are there any similar sites in your mind that might be identified, similar to any of the themes presented in the screen? So if you could think of do you have any favorite sites or any heritage sites in mind?
And here we have forgotten that actually there are so many changes in the 20th century that is so important.
I also believe that because it's the industrialization, the modernization contributes to that kind of idea, because if we look at the first ECOMOS Charter, which is the Venice Charter, it's more of like monuments and buildings itself. But as we try to advocate for the conservation of the recent heritage, which is the 20th century, obviously, we could see the expansion of the theme and the idea of how heritage evolves through different kinds of stakeholders, and this kind of approach from the public or the bottoms-up approach or from the grassroots level is instantly contributing to the development of cultural significance, which the other charters are also promoting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think you're right, Claudia. I think that's one of the big changes that's happened in my life in conservationism is it started being the purview of experts, of great architects, of great designers, of monumental buildings.
Yes.
And one of the things that happened in Australia was when we started looking at conservation here, we didn't feel we needed that kind of preservation. We needed something that was more about places. So we chose to use the word place instead of monuments and sites.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And by that, we included cultural landscape, tram lines, ocean terminals, all those kind of things immediately came to be heritage. And what happened was there was a strong recognition that this was really what the stakeholders, what communities saw as heritage. the art experts might admire the church or the monument, but the communities felt that what they wanted to look after was their more locally relevant heritage. So it's a change, I think, in the last 30 to 40 years. It's quite strong in heritage now.
I do have a question about, the framework. I'm a planner by training, and I have to say that 20th century is not a very nice century to humankind. One of the themes, you have these wars, we have 2 world wars, we have a Great Depression, we have climate crisis as a result of massive modernization and industrialization, and also this very dark history of colonialism, imperialism, which Hong Kong also experienced.
Yeah.
So I have a feeling that the framework seems to emphasize more on the bright side of humankind. I don't know, but
I wish it could.
but actually, a lot of people have suffered as a result of the 20th century developments. I mean, basically, the developed world is actually the minority, and the majority actually are the less developed ones. I don't know, how we're going to deal with the heritage there. Yeah. So
this is a very important issue, and thank you for bringing it up. And when you get a chance to read the essays, you'll see that each of them deals with this issue very specifically, because I can only give you a few kind of key points in a quick run through. But of course, different countries, different regions of the world experience these themes both at different times and in different ways. So, for example, when we think about agriculture, the increasing mechanisation and the industrialisation of agriculture has alleviated desperate famines in many parts of the world. It has also fundamentally changed the way in which our climate operates. So there are good things that have come from it and bad things that have come from it. And if we look back in history, many of the changes of history have the same impact. There are some things that win and some things that don't win. I think in heritage, though, we're trying to tell a wide range of stories. We're not trying to hide the dark. We're not trying to pretend they didn't happen, although certainly in the last century we may have done that for a while. I think now there is a great openness and transparency about telling the full range of experiences that happen. So when we look at a site, we no longer see it as, for example, I'll use a site here in Sydney. When I look at our town hall, I know that the City Hall here in Sydney it's a grand Victorian kind of building, and it represents advancement and city, management. But in fact, it also represents the fact that thousands of people were moved in different areas out of the city.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sheridan.
Thank you, Sheridan.